Round the Fire. 9. The Story of the Jew's Breastplate. My particular friend, Ward Mortimer, was one of the best men of his day in everything connected with Oriental archaeology. He had written largely upon the subject, and he had lived for 2 years in a tomb at Thebes, while he had excavated the Valley of the Kings. And finally, he had created a considerable sensation by his exhumation of the alleged mummy of Cleopatra in her inner room at the Temple of Horus at Philae. With such a record at the age of 31, it was felt that a considerable career lay before him, and no one was surprised when he was elected to the curatorship of Belmore Street Museum, which carries with it a lectureship at the Oriental College and an income which has sunk with the fall of land, but which remains at the ideal sum, which is large enough to encourage an investigator, and not so large as to venerate him. There was only one reason which made Ward Mortimer's position a little difficult at Belmore Street Museum, and that was the extreme eminence of the man whom he had to succeed. Professor Andreas was a profound scholar and a man of European reputation. His lectures were frequented by students from every part of the world, and his admirable management of the collection entrusted to his care was as commonplace as learned societies. There was, therefore, considerable surprise when, at the age of 55, he suddenly resigned his position and retired from those duties which had been both his livelihood and his pleasure. He and his daughter left a comfortable suite of rooms which had formed his official residence in connection with the museum, and my friend Mortimer, who was a bachelor, took up the quarters there. On hearing of Mortimer's appointments, Professor Andreas had written him a very kindly and flattering congratulatory letter. But I was actually present at the first meeting, and I went with Mortimer around the museum when the professor showed us the admirable collection which he had cherished so long. The professor's beautiful daughter and a young man, Captain Wilson, who was, as I understood, soon to be her husband, accompanied us in our inspection. There were 15 rooms in all, but the Babylonian, the Syrian, and the Central Hall, which contained the Jewish and Egyptian collection, were the finest of all. The Professor Andreas was a quiet, dry, elderly man with a clean-shaven face and an impassive manner, but his dark eyes sparkled and his features quickened into enthusiastic life as he pointed to us the rarity and the beauty of some of his specimens. His hand lingered so fondly over them that one could read his pride in them, and the grief in his heart now that they were passing from his care into that of another. He had shown us in turn his mummies, his papyri, his rare scarabs, his inscriptions, his Jewish relics, and his duplication of the famous 7-branched candlestick of the temple, which was brought to Rome by Titus, and which is supposed by some to be lying in the instant in the bed of the timber. When he approached the case, which stood in the very center of the hall, and he looked down through the glass with reverence in his attitude and manner. "This is no novelty to the expert like yourself, Mr. Mortimer," he said, "and I dare say that your friend, Mr. Jackson, will be interested to see it." Leaning over the case, I saw an object some 5 inches square, which consisted of 12 precious stones in a framework of gold, with golden hooks at 2 of the corners. The stones were all varying in sort of color, but they were of the same size. Their shapes, augment, and gradation of tints made me think of a box of watercolor paints. Each stone had some hieroglyphic scratched on its surface. "You've heard, Mr. Jackson, of the Urim and the Thummim?" I had heard the term, but the idea of its meaning was exceedingly vague. The room in the throne was a name given to the jeweled breastplate which lay upon the breast of the high priest of the Jews. They had a very special feeling of reverence of it, something of the feeling which an ancient Roman might have had for the syllabant books of the Capitol. There are, as you see, 12 magnificent stones inscribed with mystical characters. Counting them from left-hand top corner, the stones are carnelian, peridot, emerald, ruby, lapis lazuli, onyx, sapphire, agate, amethyst, topaz, beryl, and jasper. I was amazed at the variety and beauty of the stones. Has the breastplate any particular history? I asked. It was a great age and of immense value, said Professor Andreas. Without being able to make an absolute assertion, we have many reasons to think that it was possible that it may be the original Urim and Thummim of Solomon's temple. There is certainly nothing so fine in any collection in Europe. My friend Captain Wilson here is a practical authority upon precious stones, and he would tell you how pure these are. Captain Wilson, a man with a dark, hard, incisive face, was standing beside his fiancée at the other side of the crate. Yes, he said certainly. I have never seen finer stones. And the goldwork is also worthy of attention. The ancients excelled in... He was apparently about to indicate the setting of the stones when Captain Wilson interrupted him. You'll see the finer example of the goldwork in this candlestick, said he, turning to another table. And we all joined him in admiration of the embossed stem and delicately ornamented branches. Altogether, it was an interesting and a novel experience to have the objects of such rarity explained by so great an expert. And when finally Professor Andreas finished our inspection by formally handing over the precious collection to my friend, I could not help pitying him and envying his successor, whose life was in the past and so pleasant a duty. Within a week, Lord Mortimer was duly installed in his new set of rooms and had become the autocrat of the Belmore Street Museum. After a fortnight afterwards, my friend gave a small dinner to half a dozen bachelor friends to celebrate his promotion. When his guests were departing, he pulled my sleeve and signaled to me that he wished for me to remain. "You have only a few hundred yards to go," said he, "and I was living in the chambers of Albany. You may as well stay and have a quiet cigar with me. I very much want your advice." I relapsed into an armchair and lit one of his excellent Matronas. When I had returned from seeing the last of his guests out, he drew a letter from his dress jacket and sat down opposite to me. "This is an anonymous letter which I received this morning," he said. "I want just to read it to you and have your advice." "You're very welcome to it for what it's worth." This is how the note runs. "Sir, I should strongly advise you to keep a very careful watch over many valuable things which are committed to your charge. I do not think that a present system of a single watchman is sufficient. Be upon your guard, for an irreparable misfortune may occur." "Is that all?" 2 weeks is a fortnight. "Yes, that is all." "Well," said I, "it is at least obvious that it was written by one of the limited number of people who are aware that you have only one watchman at night." Lord Mortimer handed me the note with a curious smile. "Have you an eye for handwriting?" said he. "Now look at this." He put another letter in front of me. Look at the C in congratulate, and the C in committed. Look at the capital I. Look at the trick of putting the dash instead of a stop. They're undoubtedly the same hand, with some attempts to disguise in case of the first one. The second, said Lord Mortimer, is a letter of congratulation which was written to me by the Professor Andreas upon obtaining the appointment. I stared at him in amazement. Then I turned over the letter in my hand, and there, sure enough, was Martin Andreas signed upon the other side. There could be no doubt in my mind of anyone who had the slightest knowledge of the science of graphology that the professor had written the anonymous letter warning his successor against thieves. It was inexplicable, but it was certain. Why should he do it? I asked. Precisely what I should wish to ask you. If he had any such misgivings, why would he not come and tell me direct? Will you speak to him about it? There again I am in doubt. He might choose to deny that he wrote it. At any rate, said I, this warning is meant in a friendly spirit, and I should certainly act upon it. Are the present precautions enough to ensure you against robbery? I should have thought so. The public are only admitted from 10 till 5, and there is a guardian in every room. It stands the door between them, and so commands them both. But at night, when the public are gone, we are at once put up with the great iron shutters, which are absolutely burglar-proof. The watchman is a capable fellow. He sits in the lodge, but he walks around every 3 hours. We keep one electric light burning in each room all night. It is difficult to suggest more, short of keeping your day watchers all night. We could not afford that. At least I should communicate with the police and have a special constable put it outside in Belmore Street, said I. As a letter, if the writer wishes to be anonymous, I would think he has the right to remain so. We should trust to the future to show some reason for the curious course which he has adopted. So we dismissed the subject, but all that night, after my return to my chambers, I was puzzling my brain as to what possible motive Professor Andreas could have for writing an anonymous letter warning to his successor. For that the writing was his was certain to me, but as to actually see him doing it. He foresaw some danger to the collection. Was it because he foresaw that it was abandoned in charge of it? But if so, why should he hesitate to warn Mortimer in his own name? I puzzled and puzzled, until at last I fell into a troubled sleep, which carried me beyond the usual hour of my rising. I was aroused in a singular and effective method, for about 9 o'clock my friend Mortimer rushed into my room with an expression of consternation upon his face. He was usually one of the most tidy men of my acquaintance, but now his collar was undone at the end, his tie was flying, and his hat was at the back of his head. I read his whole story in his frantic eyes. "The museum has been robbed," I cried, springing up in bed. "I fear so. Those jewels, the jewels of the Urim and Thummim." He gasped because he was out of breath from running. "I'm going to the police station. Come to the museum as soon as you can, Jackson. Goodbye." He rushed distractedly out of the room, and I heard him clatter down the stairs. It was not long until I was following his directions, and I found when I arrived that he had already returned with the police inspector and another elderly gentleman, who proved to be Mr. Purvis, one of the partners of Morrison and Company, the well-known diamond merchants. As an expert in stones, he was always prepared to advise the police. They were grouped around the case in which the breastplate of the jeweled priest had been exposed. The plate had been taken out and laid upon the glass on top of the case. 3 heads were bent to open it. "It was obvious that it has been tampered with," said Mortimer. "It caught my eye the moment I passed through the room this morning. I examined it yesterday, and that it was certain that it was containing during the night." It was, as he said, obvious someone had been to work upon it. The settings in the uppermost row of the 4 stones, the carnelian, peridot, emerald, and ruby, were rough and jagged as if someone had scraped all around them. The stones were in their places, but the beautiful gold work, which had been admired only a few days ago, had been clumsily pulled about. "Looks to me," said the police inspector, "as if someone had been trying to take out the stones." "My fear is," said Mortimer, "that he not only tried but succeeded. I believe that these 4 stones were skillful imitations which had been put in place of the originals." The same suspicion had evidently been brought to the mind of the expert, for he was carefully examining the 4 stones with the aid of a lens. He now submitted them to be several tests, and finally turned cheerfully to Mortimer. "I congratulate you, sir," he said heartily. "I will pledge my reputation that all 4 of these stones are genuine, and of the utmost unusual degree of purity." The color began to come back to my poor friend's frightened face, and he drew a long breath of relief. "Thank God! Then what in the world did the thief want?" "He probably meant to take the stones, but was interrupted." "In that case, one would expect him to take out 1 stone at a time, but then the setting of each of these would have been loosened, and yet the stones are still all here." "It is certainly most extraordinary," said the inspector. "I never remember a case like it. Let us see the watchman." The commissaire was called, and a soldierly, honest-faced man who seemed as concerned as Ward Mortimer at the inclement. "No, sir, I never heard a sound," he answered, in reply to the questions of the inspector. "I made my rounds 4 times as usual, but I saw nothing suspicious. I've been in my position 10 years, but nothing of this kind has ever happened before." "No thief could have come in through the windows?" "Oh, impossible, sir." "Or passed you at the door?" "No, sir, I never leave my post except when I walk my rounds." "What other openings are there to the museum?" "There's the door into Mr. Ward Mortimer's private rooms." "That is locked at night," my friend explained. "And in order to reach it, anyone from the street would have to open the outside door as well." "Your servants?" "Their quarters are entirely separate." Whoa, said the inspector. "This is certainly very obscure. However, there has been no harm done, according to Mr. Purvis." "I will swear that those stones are genuine." "So that appears to be entirely one malicious damage. But nonetheless, I should be very glad to be careful around the premises, and to see what we can find any trace of your visitor might have been." His investigation, which lasted all morning, was careful and intelligent, but it led to the end of nothing. He pointed out to us that there were 2 possible entrances to the museum which we had not considered. The one from the cellars by a trap door opening in the passage, and the other through a skylight from the lumber room overlooking the very chamber in which the intruder had penetrated. As neither the cellar nor the lumber room could be entered unless the thief was already within locked doors, the matter was not any practical importance, and the dust of the cellar and attic assured us that no one had used either one or the other. Finally, we ended as we began, without the slightest clue as to how, why, or by whom the setting of these 4 jewels had been tampered with. There remained one course for Mortimer to take, and he took it. Leaving the police to continue their fruitless researches, he asked me to accompany him that afternoon in a visit to Professor Andreas. He took with him the 2 letters, and it was intention to openly tax the predecessor with having written the anonymous warning, and to ask him to explain the fact that he should have anticipated so exactly as to what had occurred. The professor was living in a small villa in Upper Norwood, but we were informed by the servants that he was away from home. Seeing our disappointment, she asked us if we should like to see Mrs. Andreas, and showed us into a modest drawing room. I have mentioned incidentally that the professor's daughter was a very beautiful girl. She was tall, blonde, and graceful, with a skin as delicate tint which the French call matte, the color of old ivory or the lighter petals of a sulphur rose. I was shocked, however, as she entered to see the room, that she had changed so much in the last fortnight. Her young face was haggard, and her bright eyes heavy with trouble.
"Father has gone to Scotland," she said. "He seems to be tired and has left a good deal to worry him. He only left us yesterday."
"You look a little tired yourself, Miss Andreas," said my friend.
"I have been so anxious about Father."
"Can you give me a Scotch address?"
"Yes, he is with his brother, the Reverend David Arias. I, Vilas Androsen."
Ward Mortimer made a note of the address, and we left without saying anything to the subject of our visit. We found ourselves in Belmore Street in the evening, in exactly the same position which we had left in the morning. Our only clue had been the professor's letter, and my friend had made up his mind to start for Androsen the next day, and to get to the bottom of the anonymous letter when a new development came to alter our plans. Very early upon the following morning, I was aroused from my sleep by a tap upon my bedroom door. There was a messenger with a note from Mortimer. "Do come around," it said. "The matter is becoming more and more extraordinary." When I obeyed his summons, I found him pacing excitedly up and down the central room, while the old soldier who guarded the premise stood with military stiffness in the corner. "My dear Jackson," he cried, "I am so delightful that you have come, for this is a most inexplicable business." "What has happened, then?" He waved his hand towards the case which contained the breastplate. "Look at it." I did so, and could not restrain a cry of surprise. The setting in the middle row of precious stones had been profaned in the same manner as the upper ones. Of the 12 jewels, 8 had now been tampered with in similar fashion. The setting of this lower 4 was neat and smooth, the others jagged and irregular. "Have the stones been altered?" I asked. "No, I am certain that the upper ones are the same the expert pronounced to be genuine. I observed yesterday that the little discoloration on the edge of the emerald. Since I have not extracted the upper stones, there is no reason to think the lowers have been transposed. What do you say? Have you heard anything, Simpson?" "No, sir," the commissary answered. "But when I made my round after daylight, I'd take a special look at the stones and saw at once that someone had been meddling with them. Then I called you, sir, and told you. I was backwards and forwards all night and never saw a soul or heard a sound." "Come up and have some breakfast with me," said Mortimer, and he took me into his own chambers. "Now, what do you think of this, Jackson?" he asked. "It is most objectless, futile, idiotic business that I've ever heard of. It can only be the work of a monomaniac." "Can you put forward any theory?" A curious idea came into my head. "This object is a Jewish relic of great antiquity and sanctity," I said. "How about the anti-Semitic movement? Could one conceive that a fanatic that way might find to desecrate?" "No, no, no," cried Mortimer. "That will never do. Such a man might push his lunacy to the strength of destroying a Jewish relic, but why on earth should he nibble around every stone so carefully that he might only do 4 stones a night? We must have a better solution than that, and we must find it for ourselves. I do not think that our inspector is likely to help us. First of all, what do you think of Simpson, the porter?" "Have you any reason to suspect him?" "Only that he is the one person on the premises." "But why should he indulge in such wanton destruction? Nothing has been taken. He has no motive." "Mania?" "No, I swear to sanity. Have you any other theory?" "Well, yourself, for example. You are not a somnambulist by any chance?" "Nothing of the sort, I assure you." "Then I give it up." "But I don't, and I have a plan by which we'll make it all clear." To visit Professor Andreas? No, we shall find our solution nearer than Scotland. I will tell you what we shall do. You know that skylight which overlooks the central hall? We will leave the electric lights on in the hall, and we will keep watch from our lumber room, and you and I will solve the mystery for ourselves. If our mysterious visitor is doing 4 stones at a time, he still has 4 to do, and there's every reason to think that he will return tonight to complete the job. Excellent, I cried. We shall keep our own secret. Say nothing either to the police or to Simpson. Will you join me? With the utmost pleasure, said I, and so it was agreed. It was 10 o'clock at night when I returned to the Belmore Street Museum. Mortimer was, as I could see, in a state of suppressed nervous excitement. But it was still too early to begin our vigil, so we remained for an hour or so in his chambers, discussing all possibilities of a singular business which we had met to solve. At last, the roaring stream of hansom cabs and the rush of the hurrying feet became lower and more intermittent as the pleasure-seekers passed on their way to the stations and their homes. It was nearly 12 when Mortimer led the way to the lumber room, which overlooked the central hall of the museum. I had visited it during the day, and had spread some sacking so that we could lie with ease, and look straight down into the museum. The skylight was of unfrosted glass, but it was so covered with dust that it would be possible for anyone looking out from below to detect that he was overlooked. We cleared a small piece at each corner, which gave us a complete view of the room beneath us. In the cold white light of the electric lamps, everything stood out hard and clear, and I could see the smallest detail of the contents of the various cases. Such a vigil was an excellent lesson, since one has no chance but to look hard at those objects which we usually pass with such half-hearted interest. Through my little peephole I employed the hours in studying every specimen, from the huge mummy case which leaned against the wall to those very jewels which had brought us here, which gleamed and sparkled in the glass case immediately beneath us. There was such precious goldwork and many valuable stones scattered in the numerous cases, but those wonderful 12 which made up the Urim and Thummim glowed and burned with radiance which far eclipsed the others. I studied in turn the tomb sculptures of Saqqara, the friezes of the Karnak, the statues of Memphis, and the inscriptions of Thebes, but my eyes would always come back to that wonderful Jewish relic, and my eyes to the singular mystery which surrounded it. I was lost in thought when my companion suddenly drew his breath sharply in and seized my arm in a compulsive grip. At the same instant I saw it which had excited him. I've said that against the wall, on the right-hand side of the doorway, the right-hand side as we looked at it, but the empty was left. The left was one entered. There stood a large mummy case. To an unutterable amazement, it was slowly opening. Gradually, the lid was swinging back, and the black slit which marked the opening was becoming wider and wider. So gently and carefully it was done that the movement was quite imperceptible. Then, as we breathlessly watched it, a white, thin hand appeared at the opening, pushing back the painted lid. Then another hand, and finally a face. A face which was familiar to us both. That of Professor Andreas. Stealthily he slunk out of the mummy case, like a fox stealing from its burrow, his head turning incessantly from left to right, stepping, then pausing, and stepping again, the very image of craft and caution. Once some sound in the street struck us motionless, and he stood listening, with his ear turned, ready to dart back to the shelter behind him. Then he crept onwards again on tiptoe, very, very softly and slowly, until he had reached the case in the center of the room. Then he took a bunch of keys from his pocket, unlocked the case, and took out the Jewish breastplate, and laying it upon the glass in front of him, began to work upon it with some sort of small glistening tool. He was so directly underneath us that he bent his head over the work, but we could guess from the movements of his hand that he was engaged in finishing the strange disfigurement which he had begun. I could realize from the heavy breathing of my companion and the twitchings of his hand, which still clutched my wrist, the furious indignation which filled his heart as he saw this vandalism in this very quarter of all others where he would least have expected it. He, the very man who a fortnight before had reverently bent over this unique relic, and who had impressed the antiquity and its sanctity upon us, was now engaged in this outrageous profanation. It was impossible, unthinkable, and yet there, in the white glare of the electric light beneath us, was that dark figure with the bent gray head and the twitching elbow. What inhuman hypocrisy, what hateful depth of malice against the sexer must underlie these sinister nocturnal labors? It was painful to think of and dreadful to watch. Even I, who had none of the acute feelings of a virtuoso, could not bear to look on and see this deliberate mutilation of so ancient a relic. It was a relief to me when my companion tugged at my sleeve as a signal that I was to follow him as he softly crept from the room. It was not until we were within his own quarters that he opened his lips, and then I saw by his agitated face how deep was his consternation. "The abominable Goth!" he cried. "Could you have believed it? It is amazing. He is a villain or a lunatic, one or the other. We shall be very soon which. Come with me, Jackson, and we shall get to the bottom of this black business." The door opened out of the passage from the private entrance to the rooms in the museum. This he opened softly with his key, having first kicked off his shoes, an example I followed. We crept together through the room until the large hall lay before us, with that dark figure still stooping and working at the central case. With an advance as cautious as his own, we closed in upon him, but softly as we went we could not take him entirely unawares. We were still a dozen yards from him when he looked around with a start, and uttering a husky cry of terror, he ran frantically down the museum. "Simpson! Simpson!" roared Mortimer, and still far away from the vista of the electric light doors, we saw the stiff figure of an old soldier suddenly appear. Professor Andreas saw him also and stopped running, with a gesture of despair. At the same instant, we each laid a hand upon his shoulder. "Yes, yes, gentlemen," he panted. "I will come with you to your room, Mr. Ward Mortimer, if you please. I feel that I owe you an explanation." My companion's indignation was so great that I could see that he dared not trust himself to reply. We walked on each side of the old professor, an astonished, accomplished commissaire bringing up the rear. When we reached the violated case, Mortimer stopped and examined the breastplate. Already one of the stones in the little row has had its seam turned back in the same manner as the others. My friend held up and glanced furiously at the professor. "How could you?" he cried. "How could you?" "It's horrible, horrible," said the professor. "I don't wonder at your feelings. Take me to your room." "But this should not be left exposed," cried Mortimer. He picked up the breastplate and carried it tenderly in his hand, while I walked beside the professor like a policeman with a malefactor. We passed into Mortimer's chambers, leaving the amazed old soldier to understand matters could be best. The professor sat down in Mortimer's armchair, and turned in so ghastly a color that for an instant all our resentment has changed into concern. A stiff glass of brandy brought him to life once more. "There, I'm better now," he said. "These last few days have been too much for me. I am convinced that I could stand it no longer. It is a nightmare, a horrible nightmare, that I should be arrested for burglary
in what has for long so been my museum. And yet, I cannot blame you. You could not have done otherwise. My hope always was that I should get it all over before I was detected. This would have been my last night's work.
How did you get in? Asked Mortimer.
By taking a very great liberty with your private door. But the object justified it. The object justified everything. You will not be angry when you know everything. At least, you will not be angry with me. I had a key to your side door and also to the museum door. I did not give them up when I left. And so, you see, it was not difficult for me to let myself into the museum. I used to come in early before the crowd and cleared the streets. Then I hid myself in the mummy case and took refuge there wherever Simpson came round. I could always hear him coming. I used to leave in the same way as I came.
You ran a risk.
I had to.
But why? What on earth was your object? You, to do a thing like that? Mortimer pointed reproachfully at the plate which lay before him on the table.
I could devise no other means. I thought and thought, but there was no alternative except a hideous public scandal and a private sorrow which would have clouded our lives. I acted for the best, incredible as I now say seem to you, and I only ask your attention to enable me to prove it.
I will hear what you have to say before I take any further steps, said Mortimer grimly.
I am determined to hold nothing back and to take you both completely into my confidence. I will leave it to your own generosity how far you will use the facts which I will supply you.
We have the essential facts already.
And yet you understand nothing. Let me go back to what passed a few weeks ago, and I will make it clear to you. Believe me that what I say is the absolute and exact truth. You have met the person who calls himself Captain Wilson. I say he calls himself because I have no reason to believe that that is his correct name. It would take me too long if I were to describe all the means by which he obtained an introduction to me and ingratiated himself into his friendship and the affection of my daughter. He brought letters from foreign colleagues which compelled me to show him some attention, and then, by his own attainments, which are considerable, he succeeded in making himself a very welcome visitor at my rooms. When I learned that my daughter's affections had been gained by him, I may have thought it premature, but I certainly was not surprised, for he had a charm and manner of which conversation which would make him inconspicuous in society. He was much interested in Oriental antiquity, and his knowledge of the subject justified his interest. Often when he spent the evening with us, he would ask permission to go down to the museum and have an opportunity of privately inspecting the various specimens. You can imagine... You can imagine that I, as an enthusiast, was in sympathy with such a request, and that I felt no surprise at the constancy of his visits. After his actual engagement to Elise, there was hardly an evening which he did not pass with us, and an hour or two were generally devoted to the museum. He had the free run of the place, and when I have been away for the evening, I had no objection to his doing whatever he wished there. This state of things was only terminated by the fact of my resignation of my official duties and of my retirement to Norwood, where I hoped to have the leisure to write a considerable work which I had planned. It was immediately after this, within a week or so, that I first realized the true nature and character of the man whom I had so prudently introduced into my family. The discovery came to me through letters from my friends abroad, which showed me that his introductions to me had been forgeries. Aghast at the revelation, I asked myself what motive this man could originally have had in practicing his elaborate deception on me. I was too poor a man for any fortune hunter to mark me down. Why, then, had he come? I remembered that some of the most precious gems in Europe had been under my charge, and I remembered also that the ingenious excuses by which this man had made himself familiar with the cases in which they were kept. He was a rascal who was planning some gigantic robbery. How could I, without striking my own daughter, who was infatuated with him, prevent him from carrying out any plan which he might have formed? My device was a clumsy one, and yet I could think of nothing more effective. If I had written a letter under my own name, you would naturally have turned to me for details which I wish not to give. I resorted to an anonymous letter begging you to be upon your guard. I may tell you that my charge from Belmore Street to Norwood had not affected the visits of this man, who had, I believe, a real and overpowering affection for my daughter. As to her, I could not have believed that any influence of a man as she was. Her stronger nature seemed to entirely dominate her. I had not realized how far this was in the case, or the extent of the confidence which existed between them, until that very evening when his true character for the first time was made clear to me. I had given orders that when he called he should be shown into my study instead of the drawing room. There I told him bluntly that I knew all about him, that I had taken steps to defeat his designs, and that I neither nor my daughter desired ever to see him again. I added that I thanked him, God, that I had found out before he had time to harm those precious objects which had been the work of my lifetime to protect. He was certainly a man of iron nerve. He took my remarks without a sign of either surprise or of defiance, but listened gravely and attentively until I had finished. Then he walked across the room, and without a word, and struck a bell.
"Ask Miss Andreas to be so kind as to step this way," he said to the servant.
My daughter entered, and the man closed the door behind her. Then he took her hand in his.
"Elise," he said, "your father has just discovered that I am a villain. He knows now what you knew before."
She stood in silence, listening.
"He says that we are to part forever," he said.
She would not withdraw her hand.
"Will you be true to me, or will you remove the last good influence which is ever likely to come into my life?"
"John," she cried passionately, "I will never abandon you. Never, never. Not if the whole world were against you." In vain I argued and pleaded with her. It was absolutely useless. Her whole life was bound up in this man before me. My daughter, gentlemen, is all that I have left to love, and it filled me with agony when I was so powerless. I was powerless to save her from ruin. My hopelessness seemed to touch this man who was the cause of my trouble.
"It may not be as bad as you think, sir,"
said he in his quiet and flexible way.
"I love Elise with a love strong enough to rescue even one who has such a record as I have here. But it was yesterday that I promised that never again in my whole life would I do such a thing which she should be ashamed. I have made up my mind to do it, and never yet did I make up my mind to do a thing which I did not do."
He spoke with an air which concealed conviction with it. As he concluded, he put his hand into his pocket and drew out a small cardboard box.
"I am about to give you proof of my determination," said he. "This, Elise, shall be the first fruits of your redeeming influence over me. You are right, sir, in thinking I had hand and designs on the jewels in your possession. Such ventures have I had, charmed me, which depended as much upon the risk run upon the value of the prize. Those famous and antique stones in the Jewish priests were a challenge to my daring and ingenuity. I determined to get them.
I guessed as much.
There is only one thing that you did not guess.
And what is that?
That I had got them. They're in this box.
He opened the box and tilted out the contents upon the corner of my desk. My hair rose and my flesh grew cold as I looked. There were 12 magnificent square stones engraved with mystical characters. There was no doubt that they were the jewels from the Urim and Thummim. "Good God!" I cried. "How have you escaped discovery?"
By the substitution of 12 others, made especially to my order, in which originals were so carefully imitated that I defy the eye to detect the difference.
"Then the present stones are false!" I cried.
They have been for some weeks.
We all stood in silence, my daughter white with emotion but still holding this man by his hand.
"You see what I am capable of, Elif," he said.
"I see that you are capable of repentance and restitution," she answered.
"Yes, thanks to your influence. I'll leave these stones in your hands, sir. Do what you like about it. But remember that whatever you do against me is done against the future husband of your only daughter. You'll hear from me soon, Elise. It is the last time I will ever cause pain to your tender heart."
And with these words, he left both the room and the house. My position was a dreadful one. Here I was with these precious relics in my possession, and how could I return them without a scandal or an exposure? I knew the depth of my daughter's nature too well to suppose that I would ever be able to detach her from this man now that she had entirely given him her heart. I was not even sure how far it was right to detach her if she had such an ameliorating influence on him. How could I expose him without injuring her? And how far was I justified in exposing him when he had voluntarily put himself into my power? I thought and thought, until at last I formed the resolution which may seem to you to be a foolish one. And yet, if I had to do it again, I believe it would be the best course to open me. My idea was to return the stones without anyone being the wiser. With my keys, I could get into the museum at any time, and I was confident that I could avoid Simpson, for whose hours and methods were familiar to me. I determined to take no one into my confidence, not even my daughter, whom I told that I was about to visit my brother in Scotland. I wanted a free hand for a few nights, without injury as to my comings and goings. To this end, I took a room at the Harding Street that very night, with an intimation that I was a pressman, and that I should keep very late hours. That night I made my way into the museum, and I replaced 4 of the stones. It was hard work and took me all night. When Simpson came round, I always heard the footsteps and concealed myself in the mummy case. I had some knowledge of the gold work, but was far less skillful than the thief had been. He had replaced the fittings so exactly that I defy anyone to see the difference. My work was crude and clumsy. However, I hoped that the plate might not get carefully examined or the roughness of the settings observed until my task was done. The next night I replaced 4 more stones, and tonight I should have finished my task, and it had not been for the unfortunate circumstance which has caused me to reveal so much which I should have wished to keep concealed. I appeal to you, gentlemen, to your sense of honor and your compassion. Whether what I have told you should go any further or not, my own happiness and my daughter's future The hopes of this man's regeneration all depend upon your decision.
Which is, said my friend, that all is well that ends well, and that the whole matter ends here and at once. Tomorrow those loose lettings will be tightened by an expert goldsmith, and so passes the greatest danger which, since the destruction of the temple, the Urim and Thummim have been exposed. Here is my hand, Professor Andreas, and I can only hope that under such difficult circumstances that I should have carried myself as unselfishly and as well. Just one footnote to this narrative. Within a month, Elise Andreas was married to a man whose name, as I have the indiscretion to mention it, would appeal to my readers as one who is now widely and deservedly honored. But if the truth were known, that honor is not due to him, but to the gentle girl who plucked him back when he had gone so far down the dark road along which few return.